Did Atlantis really exist? Welcome to Calapex, where history comes to life, and every video immerses you in the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, get ready to dive into the depths of myth. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, on the forgotten shores of a sunken world, lies a name laden with mystery and fascination: Atlantis. City of gold and marble, empire of knowledge and power, it is said to have defied the gods with its pride as much as with its splendor. Some see it as the cradle of a lost civilization, others as an allegory of human decadence. Passed down through the ages, it continues to haunt minds like a mirage, too perfect to be real, too precise to be just a dream. Where did it extend? What does its abrupt collapse conceal? And what if Atlantis was not a myth, but a forgotten truth? But before embarking on a new adventure, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. Around 400 before Christ, the Mediterranean world and its margins are experiencing profound political, economic, and cultural transformations. Classical Greece, especially Athens, is undergoing a crisis after the Peloponnesian War, but sees the emergence of philosophy and rhetoric. More broadly, did Atlantis really exist? Did Atlantis really exist? Welcome to Calapex, where history comes to life, and every video immerses you in the fate of those who have shaped the world. Today, get ready to dive into the depths of myth. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, on the forgotten shores of a sunken world, lies a name laden with mystery and fascination: Atlantis. City of gold and marble, empire of knowledge and power, it is said to have defied the gods with its pride as much as with its splendor. Some see it as the cradle of a lost civilization, others as an allegory of human decadence. Passed down through the ages, it continues to haunt minds like a mirage, too perfect to be real, too precise to be just a dream. Where did it extend? What does its abrupt collapse conceal? And what if Atlantis was not a myth, but a forgotten truth? But before embarking on a new adventure, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. Around 400 before Christ, the Mediterranean world and its margins are experiencing profound political, economic, and cultural transformations. Classical Greece, especially Athens, is undergoing a crisis after the Peloponnesian War, but sees the emergence of philosophy and rhetoric. More broadly, the Achaemenid Persian Empire is strengthening. Carthage becomes a major naval power, and other civilizations, Site-Persian Egypt, Ganges kingdoms, Zhou dynasty in China, post-classical Olmec cultures, also play a global role. On the intellectual level, a shift is taking place from mythology to historical rationality, under the impetus of authors like Herodotus and Thucydides. It is in this context that Plato, born in Athens, will draw his philosophical inspiration. To grasp the articulation of these dynamics, we will successively examine classical Greece, the expanded Mediterranean space, the great contemporary civilizations, and then the intellectual context of the first critical writings on the past. In 404, before Christ, the Peloponnesian War ends with the capitulation of Athens, weakened militarily and economically. Despite losing its fleet and the dismantling of its fortifications, the city retains its intellectual dynamism, bolstered by adversity. Sparta then imposes an oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants, 404 to 403 before Christ, marked by political terror. But democratic resistance quickly allows Athens to restore its previous regime, reopening public space to debates and intellectual innovation. Philosophy is then experiencing a new surge, already influenced by Socrates, born around 400 to 70 and died in 399. Before Christ, Athens becomes the center of a critical and in-depth reflection. Plato, born around 428. Before Christ, his disciple, founds the academy around 387 before Christ, a leading institution where Platonic dialogues explore notions of justice, reality, or wisdom through rigorous dialectical inquiry. At the same time, rhetoric is developing strongly. The assembly and the courts stimulate the art of oratory, embodied by Lysias, active between 445 and 380 before Christ, Socrates between 436 and 338 before Christ, and Demosthenes between 384 and 322 before Christ, who teach how to structure a speech, choose the right arguments, and handle language with precision. Athens remains a major cultural center, combining philosophy, eloquence, and civic engagement. Other currents emerge, notably the sophists, who value the art of persuasion independently of the truth. Their teaching, focused on mastering discourse, provokes lively ethical debates. From these tensions arises a fertile intellectual climate in which Plato draws to develop his theories on the soul, the ideal city, and allegorical tales guiding towards wisdom. While Greece is a central hub of creativity, the Mediterranean basin of the 4th century before Christ is not a homogeneous space. To the east, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before Christ, remains a major power. Despite the defeats of the Greco-Persian Wars between 490 and 479 before Christ, it is reconstituting. Under Darius II, from 423 to 404 before Christ, then Artaxerxes II, from 404 to 358 before Christ, it remains a complex structure composed of satrapies led by governors. The Persians maintain order over a vast territory, from Asia Minor to India, including Egypt. Roads like the Royal Road ensure efficient movement of resources and information, promoting the spread of techniques, luxury products, and ideas towards the Aegean world. In the west, Carthage, a Phoenician colony founded towards the end of the 9th century before Christ, asserts itself as a maritime power. Located in the north of present-day Tunisia, equipped with a natural harbor and a strategic location towards Gibraltar, the city-state becomes a major crossroads between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Its oligarchy, led by influential families, finances a formidable fleet and operates an extensive trade network. Metals from Spain, grains from Africa, timber, and slaves. It controls numerous trading posts and maritime routes, extending its influence towards Sardinia, Sicily, and the Atlantic, stirring rivalry with Greek cities like Syracuse. Greece thus finds itself between two poles, Persia to the east, Carthage to the west. The city-states must deal with these powers, negotiate or assert their ambitions. This context favors cultural transfers. Artisans, mercenaries, philosophers, and diplomats circulate, bringing with them stories, traditions, and knowledge. Greek navigators in Egypt or Phoenicia bring back descriptions of architectures or customs, enriching the Hellenic imagination and erudition. Around 400 before Christ, the Mediterranean is a dynamic space, traversed by fleets carrying goods, customs, myths, and ideas. Persian, Egyptian, and Phoenician influences penetrate Greek thought, while Greek innovations, in turn, radiate. In this flourishing environment, Greece remains a major crucible, but the Persians and Carthaginians fully participate in shaping the world of the 4th century before Christ. Beyond the Mediterranean, other civilizations are also experiencing a flourishing period. In Egypt, after the Sate dynasty and the Persian conquest in 525, before Christ, pharaonic traditions and Achaemenid administration coexist. The Persians, aware of the strategic importance of the territory, respect certain Egyptian cults and maintain the Nile irrigation infrastructure. This coexistence, sometimes tense, ensures a certain cultural continuity, despite Persian influence in administration and taxation. In India, the Nanda dynasty asserts itself in the Ganges Valley from Magadha. Its power rests on abundant resources, a centralized administration, and a large army. The war elephants enhance its prestige. Although exchanges with the Aegean world remain limited, trade routes suggest sporadic circulation of products and knowledge between India and the Near East. In China, the Zhou dynasty declines in favor of the warring states, from the 5th to the 3rd century before Christ. Despite the instability, this period sees the birth of an intellectual effervescence. Confucianism, valuing morality and the exemplariness of the ruler, coexists with Taoism and legalism, focused on law and authority. China thus becomes a major center of political and philosophical thought. In Central America, the Olmec legacies, born as early as the 2nd millennium before Christ, spread to other societies around 400 before Christ. Ceremonial centers, the foundations of writing, religious systems, and monumental sculptures inspire later cultures. Without contact with the Mediterranean world, these civilizations illustrate the universal capacity of peoples to build complex societies. Around 400 before Christ, multiple kingdoms and empires, sometimes unaware of each other, ponder power, gods, or social organization. This period marks a shift in the way of recounting and understanding the past, notably in Greece, where classical historiography is born. Herodotus, around 484-425, before Christ, dubbed the father of history, collects stories, testimonies, and local mythologies in his histories, cross-referencing his sources to better understand the peoples and their values. Thucydides, born around 460 and died around 400 before Christ, younger, adopts a more rigorous approach. Having lived through the Peloponnesian War, he analyzes its deep causes and political stakes. He seeks to reveal the hidden motives behind official discourses, sketching a first vision of realpolitik centered on the quest for power and interests. In this intellectual climate, philosophy questions the status of myth. Initially a religious and moral foundation, it becomes an object of critical reflection. Plato, for instance, forges his own myths, such as the cave or Atlantis, to illustrate ideas such as justice or knowledge. This questioning is accompanied by a debate on the value of oral narratives. Storytellers, heirs of Homer, offer a story filled with divine interventions. Historians, on the other hand, seek verifiable facts and direct testimonies. This still unfinished separation between myth and history in the 4th century before Christ prepares a new outlook on the origins of peoples. In Athens, mythical versions and rational interpretations are confronted. This context fuels the emergence of philosophical and historical narratives, where myth becomes an allegory to think about the city, virtue, or vanished civilizations. Greece then oscillates between tradition and the quest for knowledge freed from legends. In the 4th century before Christ, as Athens struggled to recover from internal conflicts and rivalries with Sparta, Plato, born in 427 and died in 347, before Christ, continued his philosophical reflections at the Academy. Around 360 before Christ, he wrote Timaeus and Critias, dialogues in ancient Greek that extend the ideas developed notably in the Republic. These texts mark a turning point in the construction of the written myth of Atlantis. Plato uses his usual form of philosophical dialogue, featuring Socrates or other characters to present his theses. Atlantis is described as a powerful state, technologically and socially advanced, whose decadence leads to its downfall. The narration, abruptly interrupted in Critias, has fascinated readers from antiquity and beyond. These dialogues illustrate several theses on the cosmos, the city, virtue, and political corruption. Written after Plato's travels in Sicily with the tyrant Dionysius the Elder, they reflect a reinterpretation of the concept of the ideal city and an increased interest in cosmology and the nature of the soul. The discussions on the creation of the universe in Timaeus serve as a backdrop to the depiction of a prestigious maritime civilization whose history, supposedly passed down by Egypt, would precede legendary epics. This narrative has been perceived both as a political allegory and a saga inspired by real events. Plato contrasts an idealized Athens, a model of virtue, with a proud empire doomed to destruction. The Timaeus presents itself as a cosmological exposition. The discussion begins with Socrates, who wishes for a narrative illustrating his reflections on political organization, developed the day before in the Republic. 3 interlocutors take turns: Timaeus of Locri, a fictional Pythagorean philosopher renowned for his thoughts on the universe; Critias, close to Solon's family; and Hermocrates, in a more secondary role. The main body of the dialogue is occupied by Timaeus's speech, which expounds the genesis of the universe, the harmony of the celestial spheres, and the actions of the demiurge ordering chaos. It deals with the fundamental elements: earth, water, air, fire, the formation of stars, and living beings. Within this framework, Critias briefly introduces the city of Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, the Strait of Gibraltar. Plato describes it as a maritime superpower with advanced political organization, concentric rings of land and water, a vast network of canals, fertile lands, and a formidable fleet. This mention heralds the following narrative, intended to test Socratic political principles against a powerful civilization. Timaeus ends with Critias's announcement of the continuation of the story, developed in the dialogue that bears his name. Critias picks up the thread and offers a more detailed account of Atlantis. Plato describes in detail its geography, carved canals, bridges, the richness of temples, and the beauty of the place. The Atlanteans, descendants of Poseidon and Cleito, initially governed with justice before succumbing to vanity and conquest. Their ambition to dominate the Mediterranean puts them at odds with Athens, described as virtuous. The dialogue abruptly breaks off, with no known end. This sudden termination has fueled speculation since antiquity about the reason for the incompleteness and fascination with the Atlantean myth. Plato claims that the story of Atlantis comes from an ancient tale transmitted by an Egyptian priest from Sais. It is Critias who reports that Solon, between the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, would have gathered this knowledge during a trip to Egypt. The priests there preserved, according to Plato, millennia-old archives on columns or sacred documents, recounting events forgotten by the Greeks. The memory of peoples is erased by repeated catastrophes, floods, earthquakes, fires, while Egypt, spared and stable, keeps very ancient writings. Located in Egypt, the source of the myth reinforces its legitimacy. In Greek imagination, this country embodies wisdom. Solon, a renowned legislator and poet, adds credibility to the story. By attributing this tradition to an ancient foreign source, Plato gave his narrative an appearance of truth or, at the very least, respectability. However, many exegetes have seen it as a literary device. By linking the story to an external authority, Plato strengthened his argument while avoiding accusations of fabrication. Furthermore, this oral and written transmission constitutes a political allegory. Plato, a supporter of the ideal city, often resorts to fiction, as in The Republic. The idea that Solon received this account from Egyptian priests connects Greek legitimacy to the Egyptian antiquity. Atlantis, a vanished power, gives the narrative an epic dimension while serving the philosophical scope of the myth. Beyond the simple story of a submerged civilization, Plato pursues marked philosophical and political aims in Timaeus and Critias. He presents a model of a perfect city, inspired by Athens, opposed to a society initially virtuous, but later corrupted by greed and expansionism. For Plato, political virtue rests on harmony between wise rulers, courageous guardians, and diligent producers. When this balance breaks, the city abandons justice in favor of power and wealth. Atlantis embodies this downward spiral, driven by an imperialist desire to conquer the Mediterranean world. The Athens, Atlantis dialectic illuminates this intention. Athens embodies moderation, the common good, and respect for divine values, while Atlantis, initially just, slides into tyranny, pride, and conquest. Plato issues a warning. Any society can collapse if it succumbs to injustice. He emphasizes the role of pride, hybris, condemned by Greek tradition in the fall of empires. Atlantis becomes a mirror held up to Greece, marked by internal struggles and excessive ambitions. For Plato, the solidity of the state relies on the virtue of its leaders and citizens. This opposition serves as a political parable, illustrating the ideal of a just city against a corrupted city. Plato adds in Timaeus and Critias a cosmogonic dimension. By placing the creation of the world, an ordered cosmos, alongside the destruction of a prideful island, he highlights the fragility of human endeavors against divine or natural laws. The myth then becomes an awareness. Any power collapses if it loses measure and strays from justice. Since antiquity, the myth of Atlantis has intrigued intellectual circles. Plato's disciples, known as academicians, pondered the truth of the myth, debating between a literal reading of a vanished maritime empire and a metaphorical interpretation with a political aim. Aristotle, 384-322. Before Christ, Plato's student, described Atlantis as a useful myth, skeptical of its historical existence, but recognizing its pedagogical value in illustrating civil and moral principles. Some members of the Academy considered completing the interrupted story of Critias, but no authentic sequel has been passed down. The historian Strabo, 1st century before Christ, 1st century Anno Domini, would refer to Atlantis as a moral tale against imperial pride, marking a philosophical and moral interpretation from the post-Platonic period. Anecdotes report the interest aroused in Athens, some intrigued by the accounts related by Solon, others seeing in Atlantis an exaltation of Athenian glory. Its Egyptian origin, insertion into a major philosophical text, and unfinished character fueled passionate debates. The ancient reception of the dialogues Timaeus and Critias oscillates between historical curiosity and philosophical reflection. Plato might have contemplated a grand cosmic and ethical narrative, but the text ends with a silence that enhances the myth's allure. Atlantis, an ideal but then decadent society, has fueled the collective imagination for over 2 millennia, attesting to the power of a philosophical story capable of leaving a lasting mark, whether founded or fictional. At the turn of the 4th century before Christ, the influence of Alexander the Great spread Greek culture in Egypt, Asia, and the Near East. After his death in 323 before Christ, his generals divided the empire, giving rise to the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty in Asia Minor. The Hellenistic period saw the rise of scholarly cities like Alexandria, with its famous library, where allusions to Atlantis in Plato's works sparked interest. Scholars commented on the myth, attempted to locate the submerged empire, and confronted various sources in astronomy, geography, and philology. In Alexandria, mathematicians, cartographers, historians, and philosophers debated, some focusing on the geography of distant seas and revisiting Plato's description of a vanished island beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Among them, Crates of Malice, a grammarian from the 2nd century before Christ, originating from Cilicia, created a globe including a vast oceanic territory associated with Atlantis. He considered the existence of the submerged continent plausible, belonging to a world geography yet to be discovered. This globe, though lost, is cited by later geographers for its originality. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a mathematician and librarian of Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, famous for calculating the Earth's circumference, adopted a rational approach. Knowing Plato's account, he remained cautious about its geographical reality, estimating that the Atlantic Ocean remains largely unexplored, and myths about lands beyond the Strait of Gibraltar require caution. The curiosity of Alexandrian scholars combined mythical tradition with empirical thought. Some saw Atlantis as a fable explaining catastrophes or illustrating moral lessons, others as a hint of unknown territories. The collection of stories from navigators fueled this quest, but Atlantis remained a speculative subject on the fringes of concrete explorations. When Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean in the 2nd century before Christ, Greek culture blended into Roman civilization. Roman elites still read Plato and Hellenistic scholars, so Atlantis entered Latin literature, appearing in the works of various authors to illustrate geographic or moral concepts. Strabo, a Greek geographer and historian born around 64 before Christ and died around 24 Anno Domini, wrote under Augustus and Tiberius. In his geography, he compiled the knowledge of his time, described known lands, and briefly mentioned Atlantis, emphasizing the uncertainty of sources and the risk of confusion with other legends. For him, Plato's story was philosophically interesting, but required empirical verification, which had never been done. Pliny the Elder, an author of the 1st century Anno Domini, dedicated several passages in his Natural History to the mysteries of the Western Ocean. Published around 77 Anno Domini, this work gathered diverse knowledge. Pliny mentioned ancient vanished islands without clearly pronouncing on Atlantis, considering the discovery of new territories in the Atlantic possible, but preferring to recount verifiable facts like the Canary Islands or the African coasts. His erudition led him to view Atlantis as an intriguing hypothesis, not a demonstrated reality. Proclus, a Neoplatonist philosopher of the 5th century Anno Domini, closes this series. Writing in Greek in the Eastern Roman Empire, he studied Plato and commented on Atlantis with a metaphysical perspective. He saw the lost city as a symbol of the soul sinking into matter if it strays from virtues. He also mentioned oral traditions and ancient texts about coastal changes in the Atlantic related to erosion or natural disasters. Sensitive to the symbolic potential of the story, he did not rule out that real geographical traces might have inspired Plato. His influence attests to a lasting interest in Atlantis, embodying the continuity of the Platonic legacy into the Middle Ages. In the heart of the Roman Empire, under the Julio-Claudians and Flavians, 1st century Anno Domini, literature often took on a utilitarian or moralizing tone. Atlantis became a symbol illustrating the vanity of empires confident in themselves. Plato opposed decadent Atlantis to virtuous Athens. The Romans adopted this opposition to warn against the excesses of imperial power. Tacitus, a senator and historian of the 1st and 2nd centuries, did not directly address Atlantis, but his reflection on the corruption of power and the reversals of fate echoes the spirit of the myth, portraying Rome as threatened by its arrogance. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher of the 1st century, shares this vision of the fragility of empires. Although Atlantis does not appear explicitly, its themes of sudden reversal of fortune and human fragility in the face of natural forces correspond to the idea of a civilization that can suddenly disappear. His descriptions of catastrophes evoke a universe where man is subject to fate. Atlantis becomes a literary example, highlighting that any civilization can cease to exist if it does not remain virtuous. In imperial rhetoric, Atlantis symbolizes splendor and the risk of destruction caused by pride. Beyond Tacitus and Seneca, other later authors allude to it to illustrate the fragility of Rome in the face of invasions, crises, and internal struggles. Atlantis becomes a literary topos of human vanity, used until the 5th century Anno Domini, when the Western Empire collapses under pressure from the Germans, while the East retains some prestige. Atlantis warns. In the 6th century, the Christian religion dominates the former Roman Empire, transforming centers of teaching and monastic libraries. Atlantis arouses little interest. Biblical exegesis and faith prevail. The Church Fathers, like Augustine of Hippo 354-430, criticize the profane fables. In the City of God, he relegates mythical pagan stories to the background, incompatible with the history of salvation. References to Atlantis, already rare in Latin West, thus lose their importance. This marginalization results from a change in intellectual priorities, not formal censorship. Classical writings are preserved, but only those useful to theology or the philosophy of creation are of interest, like Plato's Timaeus, studied mainly for its demiurge, not for the sunken island. Clerics literate in Greek favor Aristotelian logic or Neoplatonic metaphysics, considering that studying a vanished nation does not serve Christian doctrine. Monastic scriptoria focus on biblical texts, lives of saints, and patristic commentaries, neglecting pagan stories. Thus, the transmission of the Atlantean myth almost completely interrupts, surviving only in a few isolated manuscripts, rarely consulted. Augustine and other fathers influenced Western thought until the 12th century, before an intellectual revival re-examines ancient texts. Their legacy places spirituality and theology at the center of knowledge, to the detriment of tales deemed fanciful. Atlantis, depicted as a submerged power, finds no place in consecrated knowledge. No formal prohibition is imposed, but it almost completely disappears from scholarly debates. Some learned monks vaguely recognize traditions of submerged lands without serious historical credit, considering them allegories of the vanity of pagan nations before God. Between the 6th and 12th centuries, the myth thus falls into a long sleep, with religious thought and lack of interest in antiquity outside theology, explaining the rarity of mentions. Clerics prefer biblical or ecclesiastical examples rather than a marginal Greek story. This silence, never total, marks a key stage in the transmission of the myth, now dormant in Christian West. While the Christian West abandoned ancient philosophies, the Islamic world favored research in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. From the 8th century, the Abbasid dynasty founded in Baghdad the House of Wisdom, where many Greek, Persian, and Indian treatises were translated into Arabic. Some texts of Plato and Aristotle thus reached Muslim scholars, who favored logic, metaphysics, and exact sciences as tools to understand creation from a monotheistic perspective. Geographical or mythological references were less important, so that the Timaeus and Critias were mainly treated for their cosmological reflections, the passages on Atlantis often being secondary or marginal without in-depth study. Among the scholars likely to know the story of Atlantis are Al-Farabi, who died in 950, and Avicenna, 980–1037. Skilled in Greek philosophy, they were interested in logic and scientific demonstration, seeking to harmonize Aristotle with Islamic theology while assimilating certain Platonic aspects. However, no detailed commentary on Atlantis is attributed to them. The subject was not part of their research and generated less interest than other notions such as the soul or the first cause. The idea of a submerged continent might also have contradicted the cartography inherited from the Greeks and developed by the Muslims, limiting studies on the Platonic superpower, seen as an ancient legend. The transmission of the Platonic story continued through scattered passages and compilations. In the 12th century, the geographer Al-Idrisi, at the court of Roger II of Sicily, gathered data for a world map. His Book of Roger, around 1154, mentions the western Atlantic, but only through rare allusions to vanished islands. These speculations about submerged lands sometimes took on a religious meaning, testifying to the divine omnipotence capable of altering geography, but lacked reliable evidence. The Arab scholars, imbued with rationalism, prioritized observation and credible accounts, delving into Atlantis only anecdotally. Thanks to their translations, fragments of the Timaeus and Critias have traversed centuries without in-depth commentary, thus preserving the essence of the tale and allowing Atlantis to remain present in the heritage transmitted to the West. At the end of the Middle Ages, European scholars were thus able to rediscover Plato thanks to this Arab mediation, which prevented the total loss of the idea of a lost island. From the 6th to the 12th century, oral traditions in Northern Europe and the British Isles preserved distant echoes of a lost land. Among them, the legend of High Brazil, a phantom island periodically appearing off the coast of Ireland, described as an idyllic domain or a submerged country, occasionally reminded of a mysterious world close to Atlantis, though without direct connection to Plato. The Nordic sagas also mention submerged kingdoms without explicit reference to Greek sources. In Cornwall and the southwest of England, the legend of Lyonesse told of a territory submerged between Mont Saint-Michel and the British coasts, leaving the Scilly Isles as remnants. While in modern times, this story has been compared to Atlantis, no clear parallel existed in the Middle Ages. These tales, nourished by natural disasters or popular imagination, were little regarded by monasteries, but maintained the idea of submerged kingdoms in collective memory, fertile for speculation about Atlantis. It remains challenging to say whether these legends stem from Plato's fragmentary writings or are local myths related to floods. Despite an apparent intellectual stagnation, Western medieval times retain tales of lost worlds. In Icelandic sagas, Welsh or Arthurian tales, this notion reappeared without establishing the link with Atlantis. The clerics viewed them as superstitions, while sailors and warriors found them a source of inspiration. These regional beliefs, mixed with the classical texts preserved by the Islamic world, ensured the survival in various forms of the idea of a hidden land beyond the seas. Upon the rediscovery of Greek thought in the 12th and the 13th centuries, these legends and Arab memories rekindled the Atlantis myth in the collective imagination. Thus, even without a precise doctrine, the early Middle Ages indirectly preserved the tenuous memory of a fascinating, vanished island. At the turn of the 13th century, Europe undergoes a profound intellectual transformation. In the nascent universities, curiosity for ancient knowledge is reborn thanks to the humanist rediscovery. Long before the exploitation of transatlantic routes, scholars gather, translate, and comment on Greek manuscripts that have been circulating for centuries in the Byzantine or Arab world. It is in this context that interest in Plato, notably for the Timaeus, which describes Atlantis, is revived. Until the Renaissance, the fascination with this fabulous island, sometimes seen as the cradle of lost civilizations, sparks varied interpretations. Scholars, navigators, cosmographers, and writers emphasize that beyond the myth, Atlantis carries a philosophical, political, and moral message. Latin translations of the Timaeus facilitate the diffusion of Platonic ideas in medieval schools and universities. Furthermore, the great Atlantic voyages of the Portuguese and Spaniards fuel the hope of discovering lost lands reminiscent of Atlantis. Finally, the literary utopias of the Renaissance, notably those of Thomas More and Tommaso Campanella, draw inspiration from this submerged island to imagine new ideal cities. At the beginning of the 13th century, many Greek texts are not yet accessible in Western Europe due to the lack of translations. Many ancient works, notably by Aristotle, had already been translated from Arabic to Latin via the scholars of Al-Andalus. However, Plato remains less present in medieval thought, as his texts circulate less easily. It is the encounter of medieval scholars with Platonic philosophy that, starting in the 13th century, reignites the exegesis of ancient myths, including that of Atlantis. William of Murbeck, born around 1215 in what is now the Netherlands, is a key translator of this rediscovery. A man of the church and a scholar sent on a mission to Byzantium, he gains access to a library of original Greek manuscripts. Fascinated, he undertakes around 1260 a very literal Latin translation of Plato's Timaeus, thus giving European scholars direct access to Platonic cosmology and the passage on Atlantis. His method aims to render each Greek term with a precise Latin equivalent to preserve the meaning. This translation spreads widely across European universities, notably in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, where scholasticism thrives through the commentary and discussion of texts. The Timaeus is studied for its ideas on the creation of the world, the cosmic soul, but also for the story of Atlantis. Some masters and students debate the political or moral significance of this passage. In Paris, some professors invoke it to illustrate the corruption of civilizations or divine omnipotence. Gradually, commentaries are added, attempting to reconcile Plato and Christian doctrine. Atlantis, a prosperous city destroyed by its pride, is sometimes seen as a metaphor for the fall of humanity or a divine punishment. However, interest remains moderate as medieval teaching prioritizes theological questions. It is only at the beginning of the Renaissance with humanism that the Platonic account arouses renewed attention. In Italy, philology is rediscovered, studying ancient texts in their original language. Scholars learn Greek to compare William of Morbecca's translation with Byzantine versions. In the 15th century, within Italian scholarly circles, Plato becomes central again. The Timaeus, with the passage on Atlantis, asserts itself in debates on ancient heritage and the interpretation of myths. In the Florentine academies of the Medici, or in Rome, under the humanist popes, the ethical dimension of the narrative is questioned. Is the fall of Atlantis a political lesson against pride and moral decay, or a fable intended to reinforce Platonic doctrine? These debates keep the literate public's curiosity alive for this ancient story. The Timaeus, thanks to Morbecca's translation and the humanist circles, nourishes philosophical reflection, but another essential factor to Atlantis's popularity during the Renaissance is the rise of great maritime voyages. Since the beginning of the 15th century, Portugal and Spain venture ever further on the Atlantic, driven by the search for trade routes, lands to conquer, and riches to exploit. Under the impetus of Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394-1460, Portuguese navigators cross the Cape Bojador, follow the African coasts, and then explore the Azores and Madeira archipelagos. Castilian and Andalusian sailors, supported by Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, conquer the Canary Islands and encourage expeditions westward. New nautical charts, called portolans, emerge at this time. Drawn on parchment, they are filled with compass roses, Rome lines, and coastal details. As sailors explore, they record islands and capes, while leaving shadowy areas filled with fabulous creatures or inscriptions indicating the unknown. These unexplored spaces fuel the imagination. Many navigators and cartographers mention fabulous lands, such as the island of Antillia or the Seven Cities, Sete Cidades in Portuguese, where bishops fleeing the Muslim invasion in the 8th century are said to have founded miraculous cities. This quest for mythical islands is reminiscent of Plato's lost Atlantis. As soon as lands to the west are reported, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, the idea of a sunken continent resurfaces. When Christopher Columbus reaches the Bahamas and the Greater Antilles in 1492, some link these West Indies to an ancient vanished world. These speculations feed curiosity and covetousness in royal courts, encouraged by the accounts of navigators describing unknown peoples and lands. Cartography, an emerging discipline, plays a crucial role in the dissemination of these hypotheses. Cosmographers like Martin Beheim or Martin Waldseemüller attempt to represent the Earth in a unified way, incorporating the coasts of the Americas. Some world maps bear annotations mentioning legendary islands such as Antillia. Atlantis is not always named, but the imaginary latitude provided by Plato in the Atlantic reinforces the idea that extraordinary ruins could one day be discovered among these archipelagos. Spanish or Portuguese chroniclers sometimes describe clues, carved stones on certain islands, absence of local populations, or indigenous tales of ancient catastrophes. Anything recalling insular isolation or a cataclysm evokes the possible reminiscence of Atlantis. Explorers, particularly those of the South American and Caribbean coasts, report that the lushness of certain islands corresponds to Plato's description of an exceptionally fertile country. Nevertheless, the majority of missionaries, colonizers, and royal administrators maintain a practical goal: to establish solid trade routes and extract resources. But among cultivated circles, Atlantis remains a recurring theme, sustained by the idea that a fabulous secret exists to the west, a legacy of a prosperous but mysteriously vanished civilization. This obsession fuels, with the progression of the Renaissance, not only cartography, but also speculative and utopian literature. For if one can imagine discovering a sunken continent, can one not also conceive of the perfect city, inspired by the organizational principles that made Atlantis glorious? The idea of the ideal city, or utopia, experiences a great boom during the Renaissance. Humanist thinkers want to reform society, correct its inequalities, and propose more just political models. In 1516, Thomas More publishes Utopia, in which he imagines a distant island whose community lives according to rational and ethical principles. Without explicitly citing Atlantis, More fits into an intellectual tradition where the isolated island serves to conceive a new society. Plato's dialogues, notably the Timaeus, likely feature among his sources, as the idea of an exceptional island with advanced techniques and political organizations directly evokes Plato's representation of Atlantis. In Utopia, urban organization is central. Everything is planned, from the distribution of houses to forms of government, to maximize collective well-being. This approach recalls Critias' description in Plato, who speaks of a great civilization with concentric rings, famous for its architectural splendor and carefully designed canals. During the Renaissance, the island becomes a perfect canvas to freely develop new forms of democracy or enlightened monarchy. More does not say that his utopia is the direct continuation of Atlantis, but he clearly relies on the idea that an isolated, lost, or distant space can serve as a social laboratory. A few decades later, in 1602, Tommaso Campanella, a Calabrian Dominican monk, wrote The City of the Sun. He describes an ideal city located in an indeterminate place, governed by a rational theocracy where communal life is based on natural philosophy and divine laws. The inhabitants share knowledge and goods, live in harmony, and are led by a priest-philosopher. This work shows that the Platonic heritage is still alive. Many commentators see in it a reminiscent of the myth of Atlantis. The power, circular organization, abundance of resources, and pursuit of perfection recall a land blessed by the gods before its downfall by pride. Beyond politics, Campanella emphasizes engineering, technical knowledge, and the harmonious use of natural resources. This valorization of scientific progress in the service of the common good extends Plato's message. Atlantis, in Critias, mastered hydraulics, the construction of ports and dams, and exploited its natural riches. In the City of the Sun, the walls are adorned with astronomical and biological representations, reflecting a universal knowledge that recalls the cosmology of the Timaeus. For Campanella, knowledge is the foundation of social greatness, but the virtue associated with faith is necessary to prevent this knowledge from leading to decadence, a Platonic warning taken up by the Dominican. In both More and Campanella, The ideal island symbolizes the hope for a better society in a Europe torn by political and religious tensions. The Italian wars, the Protestant Reformation, colonial expansion, and the discovery of new continents provoke dismay regarding the moral and political values of the Old World. In this context, the nostalgia for lost civilizations like Atlantis nurtures a desire for order, beauty, and virtue. Whether named or suggested, Atlantis confers an aura of archaic grandeur to reform projects. At the end of the 16th century, humanist libraries gather the works of Plato and treatises on maritime exploration, blending discourses on the fall of Constantinople in 1453 with the euphoria sparked by the discovery of the New World. Atlantis, alternately legend or possible historical fact, unconsciously connects antiquity to the Renaissance, symbolizing both the intellectual power of classical Greek and the audacity of modern navigators. This mythical island fuels a new art, the printing press, which spreads throughout Europe. Florentine and Venetian printers publish carefully crafted editions of Plato's works, from the Timaeus to the Laws, accompanied by scholarly commentaries. Cultivated readers, often guided by circles of scholars, rediscover ancient Greek and the allegorical richness of the stories. Atlantis provokes as many questions as certainties. Some philosophers see in it an account of real events situated about 9,000 years before Plato. Others, a simple educational fable. The Renaissance places unprecedented value on reason and experimentation, also present in Plato's description of Atlantis, where geography, engineering, and agriculture follow empirical knowledge and quasi-scientific organization. Humanism, born in Italy and then spread to France, England, and Germany, makes man the measure of all things while placing him in the Greco-Roman tradition, of which Plato is a pillar. Man is capable of great achievements and spectacular downfalls, a dualism reflected in the contrasted destiny of Atlantis, glorious then destroyed. In the 17th century, scientific minds prepare to test or refute the existence of a submerged island, but the Platonic figure of Atlantis has already left its mark on the collective imagination. With the discovery of the Americas, everyone imagines finding the remains of this civilization one day, encouraged by exotic testimonies often amplified to please patrons. Simultaneously, the idealistic conceptions of More and Campanella inspire literary creation, building on the ruins of a forgotten kingdom, the foundations of a just and virtuous society. Thus, Atlantis remains a major point of reference, a symbol of the past greatness of humanity, and a warning against its weaknesses. The Timaeus, translated by William of Moerbeke, remains at the heart of philosophical studies, fascinating for its link between cosmology, morality, and fabulous history. Navigators fuel the legend by drawing on their maps islands similar to Plato's vanished land, while writers from More to Campanella revive the utopian spirit, placing the Platonic ideal at the center of their dreamed cities. From the 13th to the 16th century, the revaluation of ancient texts, maritime explorations, and the emergence of humanist literature brought Atlantis back to life. Once forgotten during the Middle Ages, the submerged island was now translated, read, and commented upon in scholarly circles. It became associated with the uncertainties and hopes linked to the discovery of new worlds and was integrated into the utopia of an ideal society. Inherited from Plato's Timaeus, this legend inspired Renaissance reformers, convinced that the study of great past civilizations, real or mythical, illuminated the path to a better future. Atlantis ceased to be a lost island, in time to become a mirror held up to humanity, a founding myth promising renewal and wisdom. In the 17th century, the idea of a submerged Atlantis resurfaced in a European context, marked by the expansion of great maritime powers like Spain, Portugal, England, and the Dutch republics. Explorers had been traversing the oceans for over a century, accumulating new geographical data. Plato's accounts, drawn from the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, resonated with the emerging cartography that sought to represent the world with increasing precision. The first atlases circulated among intellectuals, while some scholars attempted to reconcile maritime discoveries with ancient mythical traditions. It is in this context that the German Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, born in 1602, intervened. A scholar and jack of all trades known for his work on the Egyptian language, music, volcanoes, and optics, Kircher published Mundus Subterraneus in 1665, a monumental work on the subterranean world, invisible waterways, volcanoes, geothermal phenomena, and the relationships between the Earth's surface and internal cavities. Kircher devoted a special section to Atlantis, which he placed on a map between the Iberian Peninsula and the American continent, suggesting that this territory had been submerged during an ancient cataclysm. He drew his sources from Platonic texts, ancient legends, and his geological hypotheses. The most striking feature of this map is the north-south inversion. The top corresponds to the south and the bottom to the north. This inversion, sometimes due to engraving errors at the time, is assumed by Kircher, underscoring the complexity of geographical knowledge and suggesting other ways of envisioning the world, especially at a time when discoveries compelled the constant revision of established knowledge. Mundus Subterraneus found success in the educated circles of Western Europe. The work fueled debates about the internal structure of the Earth and the natural forces that could explain the past existence of a now submerged continent. Kircher imagined an underground network of corridors, waters, and lava, capable of causing significant upheavals on the surface, potentially having destroyed Atlantis and submerged its remains. His engravings fascinated beyond the scholarly world, feeding the myth in the minds of an enlightened audience, eager for wonders and ancient stories. At that time, cartography was not just a navigational tool, it also embodied a field of imagination. Representations of unknown territories, whether polar regions, southern continents, or submerged lands, resonated with geographers, missionaries, and encyclopedists. Kircher's map illustrates the desire to synthesize ancient, biblical, and scientific knowledge to give coherence to world geography. Atlantis thus appeared as a bridge between a legendary past and modern realities, reminding us that many mysteries remain hidden beneath the waves. In the 18th century, the European intellectual landscape transformed with the emergence of the Enlightenment, a movement advocating reason, critical thinking, and the scientific method. Scholars multiplied expeditions and field observations, scrutinized fossils, assessed changes in terrain, and sought to understand the Earth's formation over long periods. It was the age of a proto-geology that, although still reliant on sacred texts, began to emancipate itself from religious interpretations. Speculations about Atlantis raised the question of geological evolution. If a continent disappeared, what submerged it? A universal flood, or more localized tectonic and volcanic forces? French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, 1707-1788, established himself as a major figure thanks to his Histoire naturelle générale et particulière. He proposed a bold vision of the Earth's history based on a progressively cooling globe. He attributed the formation of continents and oceans to natural processes, rejecting explanations based solely on the Bible. To support his hypotheses, he studied the distribution of species on continents, questioning the existence of once-emerged land bridges that allowed the dispersion of fauna and flora. Atlantis then took the form of a possible oceanic isthmus. Simultaneously, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, 1736–1793, an astronomer and historian of science, was interested in vanished civilizations and myths of common origins. He argued that the legends of a sunken continent might reflect a distorted memory of an ancient golden age shared by various traditions like Greek accounts and Vedic texts. To him, Atlantis symbolized the initial phase of an earlier civilization originating from polar or northern regions and diffused across Eurasia. Even though his scientific rigor was contested, his approach illustrated the importance of myth in debates about the antiquity of humanity. These visions face a challenge: how to explain the submersion of vast territories. Some view it as Noah's flood, a historical and universal event that reshaped the Earth. Others, influenced by nascent volcanology, consider geological cataclysms, eruptions, crust collapses, or earthquakes responsible for the submergence. Proponents of geological violence cite the Azores or the Canary Islands as the remaining peaks of Atlantis. This debate introduces the notion of time and the gradual nature of Earth's transformations, paving the way for future geological trends of the 19th century. Methodologically, a desire to confront hypotheses with experience asserts itself. The first descriptions of stratigraphy allow for rough dating of sedimentary layers. Marine fossils discovered far from coasts fuel the theory that the sea once covered lands now emerged or left submerged plateaus dry. Through these theses, Atlantis becomes a case study. Proving or refuting its existence could shed light on the role of natural catastrophes and geological time in the genesis of continents and oceans. Among the notable events of the 18th century, one can cite the expedition of Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupertuis, astronomer and geometer, supported by the Academy of Sciences of Paris. At the time, one of the major scientific questions was the true shape of the Earth. Is it flattened at the poles, as Isaac Newton and the theorists of gravitation claimed, or elongated according to a more Cartesian model? To clarify this mystery, it was decided to measure the length of a meridian arc at different latitudes and compare the results, as a degree of latitude should be longer near the poles than at the equator if the Earth is flattened. In 1736, Maupertuis traveled to Lapland in northern Sweden, accompanied by a small team of scientists. In difficult climatic conditions, they conducted very precise astronomical and geodetic surveys, using instruments like the mobile quadrant to measure the height of stars and multiplied triangulations in the field. After several months, they established that a degree of the meridian is indeed more extended in Lapland than at the equator, which confirms the Newtonian hypothesis of an Earth slightly flattened at the poles. This conclusion influences the debates on Atlantis. The confirmation of a flattened Earth rules out certain theories postulating an enormous polar elongation or an axial tilt that submerged a continent. Before this mission, some believed that ancient deformations of the planet, due to a global cataclysm, could explain the disappearance of vast territories, even invoking Earth's rotation as the cause of gigantic upheavals. Maupertuis' experience shows that the shape of the Earth is explained by gravitational laws, without needing to resort to a planetary cataclysm suddenly destroying Atlantis. However, this scientific advancement does not abandon the possibility of a submerged continent. Plato's accounts, extensively commented upon, remain fascinating. The rigorous effort deployed by Maupertuis and the Enlightenment philosophers reconfigures the discourse on Atlantis, which ceases to be the prerogative of theology or literary scholarship, to become a subject of study on geological transformations and a link between Europe and its mythical prehistory. After this expedition, there is a shift away from fanciful hypotheses. Several thinkers, sensitive to the idea of a symbolic tale, see Atlantis as an allegory or a warning about the fragility of civilizations. Others, like Bailey, perceive it as a trace of a distant memory to be decoded by comparing world mythologies. Thus, the confrontation between precise scientific measurements and ancient legends characterizes the end of the 18th century. Between the publication of Kircher's map in 1665 and Maupertuis' expedition to Lapland around 1736, Atlantis becomes an obligatory passage in debates on the shape of the globe, the arrangement of continents, and the primordial history of the Earth. Its uncertain status between myth and possible geological fact places it at the boundary between scholarship and empirical investigation. Hypotheses of a volcanic collapse, a natural bridge between Europe and America, or a biblical cataclysm fuel controversies that contribute to the advancement of knowledge. The Earth, whose relief and model remain little known at the time, is a vast laboratory where these questions are intertwined. Each scientific advancement, whether in cartography, geodesy, or fossil observation, serves to confirm or challenge the existence of a once powerful Atlantic land. The discussion on Atlantis pushes scholars to explore usually compartmentalized fields: geography, mineralogy, comparative mythology, theology, and astronomy. This interdisciplinarity before its time is a legacy of the 17th and 18th centuries to subsequent researchers who will continue the quest for empirical confirmation or definitive refutation of the Platonic myth. At the heart of these debates, Kircher, Buffon, Bailey, and Maupertuis embody different views on Atlantis: cartographic and illustrative, naturalistic and cosmological, historico-literary, and mathematical geodesic. All testify to a growing curiosity to understand the dynamics of the planet and the ancientness of humanity. This period, often called the Century of Explorations and Geographic Hypotheses, lays the foundation for an emerging science still imbued with legends, but oriented towards a rational approach. For these generations, Atlantis remains a laboratory of ideas where mythology and geology vie for a central place in controversies. In the 19th century, Europe experiences an intellectual and artistic effervescence marked by Romanticism, a movement that exalts emotion and values the rediscovery of national myths. Atlantis, already mentioned by Plato, arouses renewed interest. Writers, academics, and autodidacts reinterpret this sunken continent as a possible key to the origins of several cultures. Advances in the study of ancient remains and the rise of nascent archaeology encourage the search for concrete evidence, while the collective imagination is fueled by stories evoking the lost grandeur of a flourishing civilization. This century sees the convergence of a thirst for historical legitimacy of emerging nations, an attraction to esotericism, and an encouragement to explore the past concretely. This period paves the way for multiple interpretations, between speculation and a methodical approach anchored in archaeological reality. The quest for Atlantis fits into a context of nationalistic awakening. Notable publications like that of Ignatius Donnelly, sea excavations in the Aegean, and esoteric currents integrating the myth into a spiritual vision. These approaches reflect the hopes and debates of a changing society, ready to embrace hypothetical audacity and demand proof. For an international audience, it is important to highlight the complexity and appeal of a myth, stimulating patriotism, scientific curiosity, and metaphysical reflection. In the 19th century, national sentiment strengthens in many European countries, fueled by revolutions and liberation movements. Atlantis becomes a narrative capable of giving people's ancient and prestigious roots. Irish intellectuals, seeking cultural legitimacy against England, imagined that the Emerald Isle might draw its origins from an Atlantean branch. Without tangible proof, they evoke linguistic or legendary similarities, nurturing the idea of a noble and millennia-old lineage. Among the Basque, whose language is reputed to have no clear link with Indo-European idioms, some scholars speculate about an Atlantean lineage, explaining the uniqueness of their vocabulary as a remnant of a forgotten civilization. These hypotheses, although lacking scientific basis, serve a valorizing identity discourse. In Scandinavia, the quest for a submerged land relies on the cultural renaissance of Nordic sagas. Some authors portray Scandinavia as a refuge or heir of a surviving Atlantean people, linking their epic mythology to Platonic accounts. Throughout Romantic Europe, Atlantis becomes a malleable symbol, adaptable to cultural and political claims. These Atlantean affiliations often rely on approximate linguistic comparisons, oral legends seldom transcribed, and a collective desire to re-enchant an idealized past. These appropriations aim less to establish a historical fact than to stimulate national pride. Despite their speculative nature, these narratives popularize the myth, fuel the desire to learn more, to excavate sites, or to find clues in folktales. The nationalist awakening thus confers on Atlantis an almost magical aura, inspiring the first steps of an archaeology seeking to validate or invalidate these legends. Among the notable authors of this era, Ignatius Donnelly, a former American politician, is interested in historical enigmas and Atlantis. In 1882, he publishes Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, rapidly becoming an international success. Donnelly describes Atlantis as the mother of all civilizations, proposing that the great cultures of the Old and New Worlds drew their knowledge from a single original source. This postulate, based on analogies between Egyptian and pre-Columbian pyramids or mythological similarities, captivates a large audience in search of a unifying narrative. He embodies the romantic spirit, wanting to explain cultural convergences through the heritage of a mysterious continent. However, the scientific community remains skeptical, as Donnelly does not adopt a rigorous methodology. He mixes classical references, oral traditions, and personal interpretations without clearly distinguishing speculation from factual analysis. Despite this lack of formal evidence, his book exerts a strong influence, translated into several languages, stimulating the imagination of enthusiasts and intensifying the desire to locate Atlantis. He also suggests that several flood myths, present in the Bible or Mesoamerican legends, could stem from a single catastrophic event linked to the disappearance of this island empire. By bringing together these sources, he creates a global narrative capable of igniting nationalists and esoteric circles. Although his hypotheses have been widely contested, they popularized the idea of an Atlantis having globally disseminated its knowledge. This vision reinforces the allure of a common and idealized past, explaining human progress, and its legacy inspires 20th century oceanographic research and more marked esoteric theories. Parallel to these debates, the regions of the Aegean Sea become a favored field of investigation. In the 19th century, researchers like Heinrich Schliemann uncover Troy and Mycenae, sparking enthusiasm for pre-classical civilizations. There is increasing curiosity about Crete and the Santorini archipelago, sometimes called Thera in antiquity. Even though major excavations at Akrotiri by Spiridon Marinados will only take place in the 20th century, the idea of a volcanic catastrophe devastating an advanced culture is already circulating. According to geological evidence, Santorini experienced a violent eruption around the 2nd millennium before Christ, causing devastating tsunamis. Some see this as the origin of the legend of Atlantis, suggesting that Plato might have drawn from the collective memory of the Minoan civilization destroyed by this cataclysm. Archaeological discoveries, notably frescoes and sophisticated objects 7 centuries older than the classical period, fuel the theory of a flourishing maritime culture. For many 19th century travelers, these remains testify to a past when Greece was home to a prestigious naval power, reminiscent of the opulent island described by Plato. Submarine exploration remains rudimentary, but speculations about the existence of sunken cities circulate in the press and scholarly circles. It is beginning to be considered that the abrupt fall of the Minoan civilization might have been accompanied by a foundational narrative transmitted orally and modified over the centuries. Skeptics highlight the lack of explicit links between the Mycenaean or Minoan communities and Atlantis, recalling that Plato places the myth well beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Nevertheless, the hypothesis of an Aegean origin for Atlantis is gaining supporters, intrigued by the correlation between a real cataclysm and the destruction of an advanced civilization. Excavations in Crete, revealing complex palaces like Knossos, reinforce the idea of sophistication comparable to the Platonic description. The Aegean Sea thus becomes a major ground for conjectures, blending nascent archaeology, romantic imagination, and the quest for a lost city. While archaeology organizes and nationalism shapes collective identities, another movement develops, esotericism. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in 1875, dedicated to the quest for a universal wisdom uniting diverse spiritual traditions. In The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, she discusses Atlantis as a cyclical stage of human evolution. According to her, an Atlantean root race preceded the current humanity, endowed with considerable psychic faculties. Corrupted by its pride, this civilization would have perished in a catastrophe, causing the submersion of its continent. This vision exceeds that of Plato, inserting Atlantis into an esoteric framework encompassing India, Egypt, and other centers of knowledge. Blavatsky sees in these civilizations the inheritors of primordial knowledge transmitted by Atlantis before its disappearance. For the Theosophical Society, Atlantis is a forgotten memory of humanity, symbolizing the boundary between psychic greatness and moral downfall. The Atlantean narrative becomes a lesson on the untimely use of subtle forces, perceived as latent powers in everyone. This interpretation resonates in the occultist circles of the late 19th century, seeking to reconcile science and mysticism. Unlike Donnelly, the Society does not aim to prove the geographical reality of Atlantis, but to highlight its role in human spiritual progression. The submersion symbolizes the self-destruction of an unbalanced society. Some readers integrate Atlantis into a global narrative, mixing sacred legends and ancient texts. Critics see therein excessive syncretism, away from the emerging scientific criteria. Nevertheless, Blavatsky and her followers ensure renewed popularity for Atlantis, no longer solely as an archaeological enigma, but as a spiritual archetype. The idea of a lost continent, a reminiscence of forgotten wisdom, then fuels numerous esoteric currents and inspires subsequent movements, mixing Eastern traditions, magical practices, and fantasies about the unknown powers of ancient peoples. This trend keeps Atlantis at the heart of popular imagination, between the search for historical truth and fascination with the occult. The figure of Atlantis thus illustrates the crossroads between occult knowledge, scientific curiosity, and the quest for spiritual regeneration that animates 19th century culture. At the turn of the 20th century, Atlantis still fascinates an audience eager for extraordinary stories and scientific discoveries. Geology progresses with the study of mountain chains, paleontology sheds light on species evolution, and oceanography maps the sea floors with more precision. In this context, the idea of a vanished submerged continent finds particular resonance, offering a geographical and historical enigma to fill the gaps in knowledge. The early 20th century thus seeks to reconcile ancient legends and modern scientific methods. On one hand, new theories about the evolution of the Earth's crust are developing, aiming to remain objective. On the other hand, the general public is fascinated by adventure novels where Atlantis serves as a setting for epics blending science and the supernatural. In intellectual circles, the debate focuses on the single continental origin of ancient civilizations, fueled by studies comparing Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other regions considered as sources of cultural influences. This interest, whether academic or romantic, gives rise to an effervescence of sometimes contradictory ideas, shaping the cultural identity of Atlantis for the following decades. The publication in 1912 of the work by Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist and astronomer, marks a turning point in geology. In his book, The Origin of Continents and Oceans, he proposes the theory of continental drift. According to him, the current continents were once united in a supercontinent named Pangaea, which fragmented over time to form today's landmasses. Some see it as an argument in favor of the past existence of Atlantis. If continents could drift, why couldn't a part have sunk under the Atlantic? This theory does not immediately win unanimous support in the scientific community. Despite puzzling clues like the matching coastlines and similarity of fossils in Africa and South America, many remain skeptical due to the lack of mechanisms explaining this movement. However, the idea of Atlantis as a submerged block in the Atlantic fits within this geological framework. Thus, continental drift fuels the controversies around the Atlantean myth. At the beginning of the 20th century, fixist geologists believe that continents have been stable since the formation of the Earth, making a recent immersion unlikely. Some researchers, excited by underwater discoveries, suggest that fragments of a lost continent could exist beneath the surface, mentioning abyssal trenches, mid-ocean ridges, or shoals as possible remnants. Despite a small group of adherents, most specialists consider the Platonic tradition as an allegory rather than a historical account. Nevertheless, the idea of a tectonic cataclysm engulfing a civilization generates renewed curiosity. The debate oscillates between romantic fascination and scientific rigor. Some proponents of the Atlantean myth see in Wegener's continental drift a chance to revive the dreams of a sunken continent. Starting in the 1930s, as Germany experiences the rise of the National Socialist regime, Atlantis becomes an ideological issue for certain Nazi circles. The Ahnenerbe, founded in 1935 under the impetus of Heinrich Himmler and researchers close to the party, presents itself as an institute dedicated to studying the ancestral heritage of Germanic peoples. In this context, the quest for a mythical origin of the Aryan race sometimes turns towards Atlantis, perceived as an exceptional land that gave birth to a superior civilization. The theories mix pseudoscientific elements and arbitrary interpretations of ancient legends to justify racial supremacism. Nazi ideologues, convinced that history must legitimize their worldview, seize grandiose narratives like the Hyperborean Aryan myth. According to this speculation, northern peoples descended from a hyper-civilized society, established in a once temperate polar region or a lost continent, potentially Atlantis. This theory relies on European esoteric texts and tendentious readings of mythology, without a solid scientific basis. Despite the lack of evidence, this discourse circulates in some official German circles, encouraged by the desire to give an ancient luster to the alleged superiority of the Germans. Thus, Atlantis, anchored in the collective imagination, is instrumentalized for political and racial ends. Within the Ahnenerbe, expeditions are launched to find clues of this original civilization without concrete results. Under the direction of figures like Hermann Wirth or the explorer Sven Hedin, they study temples, ruins, and prehistoric remains in Europe and Asia. Atlantis is sometimes presented as the culmination of a journey linking the prehistoric settlements of Scandinavia, the megalithic cultures of the British Isles, and the migration route to Tibet. The idea of a bridge between Europe and the Inner Orient aims to prove the spiritual kinship between Aryan Germanic peoples of the West and Asia. These efforts, influenced by the occult thinking of the early 20th century and esoteric writings, are characterized by a confused mix of partial scholarship, misunderstood symbolism, and questionable extrapolations. They also reflect the influence of racial theories popularized by Count de Gobineau, who ranked human groups hierarchically. In the logic of the Ahnenerbe, the Atlantean myth became a propaganda tool, conferring a mystical aura to the Reich's political project. However, this instrumentalization never imposes itself unanimously in the international scientific community, which largely rejects these ideological deviations. The same period sees Atlantis gaining popularity in mass culture thanks to a pulp and fantasy literature disseminated in mass circulation magazines. The American writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft, active mainly in the 1920s and 1930s, draws on the imagination of vanished civilizations for his tales of cosmic horror. Although most of his stories take place in New England, he sometimes mentions sunken continents or antediluvian cities like R'lyeh, where the creature Cthulhu sleeps. Without always explicitly naming Atlantis, he plays with the idea of ancient lands submerged by cataclysms, still haunting human consciousness. This dark reimagining transforms Atlantis, classic and glorious with Plato, into a harbinger of madness and horror. Simultaneously, Edgar Rice Burroughs, creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, follows the Lost Worlds tradition, dear to the golden age of adventure fiction. In his novels, the discovery of unknown lands often comes with surviving civilizations from a forgotten age. Although he doesn't dedicate an entire story to Atlantis, Burroughs uses the idea of a lost continent as a narrative device, blending escape and social critique. In pulp magazines, the image of Atlantis is adorned with mystery, danger, and exoticism, reinforcing its hold on the collective imagination. The first half of the 20th century thus sees Atlantis oscillate between emerging science, ideological deviations, and literary escapism. Alfred Wegener, with his revolutionary theory of continental drift, offers a conceptual framework that revives geological speculations about a sunken continent. At the same time, the Nazi regime exploits this myth to assert a racial vision via the Ahnenerbe and the fantasy of an Aryan origin. Simultaneously, Lovecraft and Burroughs extend and transform the legend, attributing to it a sometimes horrific, sometimes wonderful dimension. Through the lens of the interwar period, Atlantis becomes a mirror of the anxieties, aspirations, and dreams of expansion of modernity. These multiple interpretations illustrate humanity's ability to shape the memory of the past, according to the stakes and imaginations of its time. Atlantis thus remains a timeless symbol, continually reinvented. After World War II, oceanographic research benefits from unprecedented technological advances that allow for the exploration of previously inaccessible seabeds. Crossing geology, marine biology, and underwater archaeology, specialists become passionate about the abysses. Major powers seek to precisely map ocean ridges, abyssal trenches, and underwater chains for both strategic and scientific reasons. The myth of Atlantis, transmitted since antiquity, experiences a resurgence of interest. The quest becomes technical as well. Submersibles, probes, and electronic instruments examine vast marine areas where some still hope to find traces of sunken cities. Missions target several regions of the Atlantic, often around the mid-Atlantic ridge, considered a probable location for Atlantis. International organizations and university teams collaborate to understand the geology of tectonic plates while keeping in mind this romantic mystery. Between 1945 and 1980, oceanographic institutions, national navies, and private companies launched numerous expeditions. Advances in underwater acoustics and sonar allowed for detailed bathymetric mapping. The first bathyscaphs, human-crewed submersibles, paved the way for dives of several thousand meters, filming, sampling, and collecting data. This period also saw the emergence of plate tectonics, which replaced the theory of continental drift. The Atlantic was then perceived as a geologically young basin, born from the gradual separation of the American and Afro-European continents. The idea that ancient territories might have sunk due to major tectonic events was revisited. Some suggested that Atlantis might have disappeared this way. However, the scientific community remained cautious, distinguishing the serious study of the mid-Atlantic plate from hypotheses about submerged civilizations. The major discoveries of the 1950s-60s focused mainly on the volcanic geology of ridges, seafloor spreading, and the role of transform faults. Atlantis enthusiasts, on the other hand, scrutinized every announcement of mysterious rock formations or geometric structures. Where science observed sedimentation, fragmentation, and volcanism, some saw human ruins. During this period, science and imagination often coexisted without fully understanding each other, despite the mutual respect between oceanographers and adventurers. In 1973, the Franco-American oceanographic program, FAMOUS, French-American Mid-Ocean Undersea Study, was launched to study the central part of the mid-Atlantic ridge, south of the Azores, and detail the formation of the oceanic crust. France deployed the submersible Archimede, capable of diving several thousand meters, while the United States provided Alvin from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. This collaboration symbolized a shared commitment to directly observing the faults, underwater volcanoes, and basalts of the ridge's active segments. Researchers were primarily interested in the tectonic separation between the North American plate and the Eurasian plate. They documented how lava spread and formed new oceanic floor, performing thermal measurements, mapping hydrothermal vents, and collecting geological samples. They descended into underwater canyons and traversed unknown volcanic landscapes, littered with fissures and solidified lava domes. The results precisely confirmed the hypothesis of oceanic accretion as formulated by plate tectonics. During these dives, geologists identified rock formations with sometimes rectilinear or columnar contours. Bathy photographs, pictures taken at depth, sparked curiosity in a fascinated public, dreaming of seeing submerged architecture there. The scientific consensus remained cautious. No human origin structures were detected. The carved blocks or linear formations resulted from volcanism, fracturing, or hydrothermal circulation. Nevertheless, the exploration stimulated the collective imagination. Journals sometimes exaggerated statements from oceanographers, amazed by the strangeness of the landscape. Researchers reminded that the region, due to intense geological movements, depth, and steep topography, did not favor the settlement of a stable civilization. These conclusions did not discourage Atlantis enthusiasts. Exploration with advanced submersibles fueled media enthusiasm. The images distributed fascinated by showing an active ocean floor shaped by tectonics, where life thrived even near hydrothermal vents. Some continued to fantasize about potential ruins in areas still little explored. An indispensable figure, Commander Jacques-Yves Cousteau, born in 1910 and deceased in 1997, was one of the pioneers of modern scuba diving. Co-founder of the Aqualung, he transformed the Calypso ship into a floating laboratory. After the war, his documentaries and oceanographic expeditions captivated the general public. Cousteau was curious about Atlantis, but his dives were primarily aimed at scientific discovery and ecosystem preservation. In the 1960s and 1970s, he visited numerous sites in the Atlantic, notably around the Azores, a Portuguese archipelago located about 1,400 kilometers west of mainland Portugal. These islands are often cited in Atlantis hypotheses because they correspond to emergent peaks of an underwater chain linked to the mid-Atlantic ridge. During his expeditions, Cousteau explores the ocean depths aboard small submarines or with divers equipped with underwater scooters. The images show rocky reliefs, natural arches, and steep slopes testifying to volcanic activity. These sequences draw media attention, always quick to evoke emotion. Cousteau, however, remains cautious and reserved about the hypothesis of a sunken city, emphasizing that the Atlantic Ocean is vast and multiform, and imagination can transform simple basaltic formations into temples or walls. His teams map several areas, note the biodiversity, and analyze the water chemistry. Some dive near seamounts to collect samples and determine the composition of the rocks. Nothing proves the presence of a lost civilization. In 1973, Cousteau produces a documentary titled Atlantis Found, where he illustrates the different hypotheses around the myth. He deliberately chooses a question mark, reminding that no certainty exists despite the legends. The film compiles footage shot in the Azores, in other parts of the Atlantic, and in the Mediterranean to feed the viewer's reflection. It contributes to making the controversy around Atlantis accessible to the general public. Spectators discover the beauty of underwater landscapes, but also understand that the arguments in favor of a submerged Atlantis remain debated and are supported neither by clear remains nor by scientific consensus. Cousteau's popularity and the magic of his images periodically revive the hope of a sensational discovery. In In 1968, divers discovered near the Bimini Islands in the Bahamas a strange underwater rock formation consisting of almost rectilinear blocks. This structure, called Bimini Road, extends for several hundred meters and resembles a road shaped by human hands. Some see it as proof of human origin, imagining slabs methodically placed like a key or the foundations of a sunken wall, which causes a strong emotion in a context of fascination for the lost civilizations of the Atlantic. Marine biologists, geologists, and experienced divers conduct several inspection missions. They show that the blocks are made of beach rock, a limestone naturally formed by the cementation of sand grains and shell fragments in tropical littoral zones. Under the action of currents, tides, and marine erosion, this material can fragment into regular, sometimes polygonal blocks that fit together like a pavement. Petrographic analyses and surveys indicate that this arrangement is explained by natural phenomena such as sea level variation, sedimentation, and tectonic fracturing. Despite these explanations, fascination remains. New Age authors claim that Bimini Road would be a vestige of Atlantis, relying on prophecies attributed to Edgar Cayce, an early 20th century American medium, who predicted the discovery of parts of Atlantis near Bimini in the 1960s. The media enthusiasm attracts many amateur divers wishing to tread this sacred path of the ancient continent. However, specialists remind that the rocks bear no traces of tools or polishing. Their composition corresponds to sandy tropical coasts, and the apparent geometry can form naturally. They invite maintaining a critical mind despite the enthusiasm. Bimini Road remains for many the symbol of an Atlantis located in the heart of the Caribbean, rather than in front of the Pillars of Hercules, as Plato mentioned. In addition to underwater explorations in the Atlantic, the period 1945-1980 marks significant advances in the study of Aegean civilizations. Santorini, called Thera in antiquity, is a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea near mainland Greece, known for a cataclysmic eruption around the 17th century before Christ. From the 1960s, several archaeological campaigns in Akrotiri, a Minoan site buried under ash, revealed frescoes, pottery, and multi-story buildings, testifying to an advanced urban center. Some researchers believe this catastrophe may have inspired, through distorted memory, tales of lost cities like Atlantis. Technological advances of the 20th century, notably the radiocarbon dating of volcanic layers, allow for a refined chronology. Several laboratories estimate that the main eruption occurred between 1627 and 1600 before Christ, coinciding with a prosperous period in Minoan Crete in the Aegean basin. The power of the eruption would have caused a megatsunami severely impacting neighboring shores. Scientific debates focus on the impact of this catastrophe on the Minoan civilization, with some suggesting that destabilization facilitated the rise of the Mycenaeans. There is mention of an economic and cultural upheaval that could have fueled later oral traditions, evoking the disappearance of a prestigious island. In 1976, a symposium in Spetses brought together archaeologists, volcanologists, and historians to discuss the correlation between the eruption and certain catastrophe myths. Rudimentary computer simulations estimated the height of the waves generated by the caldera collapse. These results indicate major destructions throughout the Aegean Sea, confirmed by unusual marine deposits on several coasts. The myth of Atlantis was revived, with some researchers suggesting that Santorini might be its historical source. However, many remind that Plato places these events several centuries before the eruption and locates Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, thus in the Atlantic. The collapse of Santorini is a plausible oral memory, but an exclusive link with Plato remains speculative. This Aegean path has gained popularity thanks to the media, which highlight the similarities between Santorini and Atlantis. Advanced society, maritime organization, port in concentric rings. The use of scientific methods such as 14C dating, fossil pollen study, or paleo-environmental reconstruction supports a scenario of eruption catastrophe that could explain a universal myth. Others contest the location and chronology with respect to the Platonic narrative. The Spetses Congress emphasizes the necessity of interdisciplinary work combining archaeology, geology, climatology, and ancient texts, an approach that guides subsequent research in Santorini, but also in the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Western Mediterranean, where other hypotheses emerge. Between 1945 and 1980, interest in Atlantis was renewed with underwater expeditions, advances in geophysics, and more scientific archaeology. The famous project shed light on ridge dynamics and proved oceanic spreading, while Jacques-Yves Cousteau popularized the study of seabeds and raised awareness of their preservation. On another continent, the route of Bimini sparked enthusiasm and controversy, demonstrating the enduring fascination with a lost continent. The investigation into the Minoan eruption confirms the extent of past geological and cultural upheavals, illustrating the importance of a multidisciplinary approach to distinguish facts and legends. This half-century of intense research sees the myth of Atlantis adapt to modernity, blending submersible imagery, scientific rigor, documentary exploration, and the power of an enigma that continues to spark global curiosity. At the turn of the 1980s, the study of Atlantis experienced a revival thanks to disciplines such as geophysics, satellite imaging, underwater archaeology, and comparative anthropology. Researchers collaborated to examine the Platonic myth in the light of more objective data. Marine geophysics progressed thanks to international programs led by UNESCO and various oceanographic institutes. Research vessels were equipped with multi-beam sonars, providing high-resolution bathymetric mapping. This technology relies on the emission of acoustic waves reflected by the seabed and allows for the deduction of underwater topography. It has enabled the precise modeling of little-known regions, such as the plateau surrounding the Canary Islands, often mentioned in speculations about Atlantis. Some researchers thought they detected the remains of a submerged landmass corresponding to the myth. After several exploration campaigns between 1985 and 1995, surveys and drillings showed that it was an ancient volcanic formation linked to the dynamics of tectonic plates. Satellite imagery has played a crucial complementary role. Since the late 1980s, projects like the European satellite ERS-1, launched in 1991, have allowed the measurement of variations in the Earth's gravity field and the detection of gravimetric anomalies under the oceans. NASA and other agencies have deployed satellites equipped with radar altimetry sensors, providing precise data on the shape of the geoid. This information, cross-referenced with sonar, has enriched hypotheses about tectonic processes in the North and Central Atlantic. It became clear that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, although active, presented no continental structure corresponding to Atlantis. These advances reinforced the idea that the key to the mystery lay in a better understanding of global ocean dynamics. The study of the East Canary Ridge illustrates the evolution of this research. In the early 1990s, several conferences in Paris and at the University of La Laguna brought together geophysicists, volcanologists, and historians to share recent mappings, evaluate anomalies detected by satellite, and debate the impact of ancient volcanic processes on legends. For example, the discovery of pyroclastic deposits off Fuerteventura suggested that significant underwater eruptions might have temporarily emerged, inspiring myths about the disappearance of an island. But analyses concluded the absence of any built structure, limiting the idea of a Canarian Atlantis. However, this work refined the knowledge of the archipelago's formation and better understood the link between volcanic phenomena and tales of submerged lands. Meanwhile, underwater archaeologists have greatly benefited from the rise of remote sensing technologies. Coastal LiDAR, initially developed to map coastlines and monitor erosion, has proven valuable for identifying submerged structures. By sending laser pulses to the seabed and measuring the return time of the reflected signal, scientists model the underwater topography with great precision. In the late 1990s, several LiDAR survey campaigns were conducted in the eastern Mediterranean, in areas reputed to house ancient remains. They allowed the detection of rock blocks arranged in a suspicious manner, suggesting quays, walls, or foundations. This type of discovery, still rare, fuels the imagination of those seeking to validate the existence of sunken cities, but caution is advised as many natural formations can mimic artificial arrangements. The site of Pavlopetri, off the southeast coast of the Peloponnese in Greece, perfectly illustrates the importance of these techniques. Discovered in the 1960s by Nicholas Fleming, a British oceanographer, this submerged urban complex is one of the oldest known sunken cities, with remains dating from the Bronze Age, around the second millennium before Christ. In the 2000s, a team led by John Henderson of the University of Nottingham undertook a 3D mapping project of the site with underwater scanners and differential GPS surveys. By comparing these data with fine topographic analyses, researchers reconstructed the layout of streets, buildings, and identified a probable administrative complex. Although Pavlopetri is not linked to Plato's tale of Atlantis, its study provides a concrete example of an ancient city lost beneath the waves and shows how the evolution of detection tools makes it possible to uncover other comparable sites, fueling the idea that the legend of Atlantis might be based on real maritime catastrophes. Alongside advances in geophysics and archaeology, comparative anthropology has recontextualized the myth of Atlantis. Many cultures around the world tell of floods or maritime catastrophes that submerged lands and cities. Among the Sumerians, the Epic of Gilgamesh mentions a universal flood, likely inspired by the catastrophic floods of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. In Mesoamerica, Aztec and Mayan myths also speak of aquatic upheavals, while in the Pacific, Polynesian traditions describe the submersion of islands due to volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. Anthropologists question the origin of these recurring themes: collective memory of real events like tsunamis or rapid sea level rises, or common archetypes of the human psyche independent of historical reality. The debates remain lively, but these stories fit into a long tradition about the loss of territories. Researchers like Claude Lévi-Strauss and Colin Renfrew have popularized two main explanations. The first, diffusionist, suggests that flood stories spread through migrations and contacts between civilizations, with a mythological core based on a historical event being adapted to different contexts. The second, of independent convergences, posits that peoples without direct links spontaneously created similar stories, inspired by frequent natural phenomena. floods, sea storms, tsunamis. Thus, it is not necessary to assume a single planetary cataclysm, but rather multiple local disasters that left a mark on collective memory. These studies tend to relativize the uniqueness of the Platonic narrative while emphasizing the universality of fascination with lost lands. In 2009, Atlantis made international headlines when an internet user, exploring Google Earth Maps, thought he spotted a very regular geometric pattern off the Canary Islands. The formation, composed of straight lines intersecting at right angles, evoked the shape of a vast underwater urban plan. Quickly, blogs and forums relayed the discovery, claiming it was irrefutable proof that the city described by Plato lay on the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean. Websites specializing in archaeological mysteries and paranormal phenomena fueled this global viral phenomenon. The most enthusiastic internet users already envisioned streets, avenues, and squares clearly marked, linking this structure to the concentric rings of the original myth. As often happens with such excitement, collective curiosity spiraled, and some began planning private expeditions to dive at this supposed site, despite the cost and complexity of such an endeavor. Disillusionment came quickly when the British Hydrographic Office explained that these traces were computer artifacts, resulting from the processing and assembly of bathymetric data collected by sonar-equipped